The panel today is opportunities and challenges in rare diseases. If like me, you've sat through several talks, you'll have seen, some of the panelists today talking about those opportunities and challenges that they have in their individual companies, but having such a great panel today, we hope to explore a little more about the general issues. So, rare diseases. There's been some good franchises built up over the years in rare diseases, and along comes cell and gene therapy, which might both address unmet disease, but also disrupt some of the existing paradigms, commercial and clinical paradigms. And I think that's going to be a really interesting session. So I talked to one of my colleagues in Big Pharma to get their big perspective before I put together the kind of sequence for this, and they really talked from their perspective about how they viewed rare diseases. And basically they thought, well, you know, generally speaking, not in every disease, generally speaking, there's a low science base backing up the rare disease because of just the nature of the rarity. There's always commercial challenges, but there's also high patient need and high target validation. So, on the one hand, we've got the difficulties of the lack of disease understanding, lack of validated endpoints, kind of the issues of natural history versus comparative data, clinical trial designs, commercial challenges versus, the positive side of, large unmet need, large treatment effects, commercial opportunities, and often patient and public advocacy. So I'm delighted to have such a fantastic panel. They're going to introduce themselves in a minute, but we've got Geoff MacKay, CEO of AVROBIO. We've got Matt Patterson. He said, call me Matt, don't call me Matthew, because it's Matthew when he's in trouble, and he's not in trouble today.
That was for a private discussion.
You should know by now that I'll do anything for a laugh. We've got Alvin She from
it's a good start.
Enzyme, and Max Colao from Abeona. So maybe we'll start at the far end, saying a few words about yourself, where you go, what the company strategy is, and we'll work through the panel, and then we'll get into the questioning. So Alvin, you're first off.
Sure, thanks Keith. As Keith mentioned, Alvin She, I'm the CEO of Enzyme. I think I'm here to provide some diversity to the panel in the sense that I'm a non-gene therapy company. So we are working on a therapeutic in conjunction with Duke University called RVT-802. And this is a therapeutic that is a immune reconstitution therapy that's tissue-derived. And it is for the treatment of a very rare disease called complete DiGeorge anomaly. Complete DiGeorge anomaly affects about 15 to 20 patients per year in the United States, and a similar incidence in other geographies. So we're talking about a very, very rare disease that's highly fatal. The natural history is that all of these patients will die by the age of 3 if untreated. So this therapeutic that we're developing with Duke has a pretty long clinical track record. Upwards of 70 patients have been treated over the past couple of decades, and the effect is transformative. We see that there's over 70% chance of survival beyond a year, and that survival benefit extends to beyond 10 years in some of the longest case studies that have been published. And so it's on the basis of this transformative clinical data that we've been able to go through some very accelerated pathways on the regulatory side. We've achieved regenerative medicine advanced therapy designation, as well as breakthrough designation, orphan designation, and pediatric priority rare disease designation. So any designation is good, and it's really helped us to really advance things. We are at the point where we've initiated a rolling BLA submission. We announced that back in July. And we hope to complete that over the next several months to enable an FDA decision sometime in the 2019 timeframe. So that's the brief introduction to Enzyme, and I'll hand it over to Matt.
Yeah.
I'm Matthew Patterson. Hi, everyone. I'm the founder and CEO of Therapeutics. First of all, I want to ask you, how many times do you use that joke, the diversity joke on the
That was the
panel?
first.
Come on. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Audentes develops AAV gene therapy products for serious and life-threatening rare disorders. We're a company of about 200 employees now, South San Francisco and San Francisco. And we have 2 programs in the clinic. Our lead program is for a severe life-threatening neuromuscular disease called X-linked myotubular myopathy, or MTM. And it's been a really exciting year. We started the clinical trial about a year ago, and starting in January, and then again in May, August, and on Friday, we are sharing updates from that study. And the great news is that we've shown really exciting early results in these boys. This is a disease that where boys, it's X-linked, boys only are born severely impaired, can't move or function like a normal child, and can't breathe on their own, importantly, so they often have mechanical ventilatory support at birth. And sadly, half of them don't see their second birthday. So thankfully, our early data is very compelling, showing really dramatic early improvement in those patients, including the first patient having come off his ventilator completely, which is something that you just don't see in neuromuscular diseases. So something we're very proud of. It's still early, a lot of work to do, but thankfully that's translated to the similar type of regulatory designations, RMAT in the US and PRIME most recently, and so we're eager to have the dialogue with the authorities about next steps, because it's a great example of a rare disease program that we hope could move quickly if the stars align. So with that, I'll stop and hand over to Geoff.
Good. Thanks for not calling me Jeffrey.
It's not on the slide.
Yeah. So I'm CEO of AVROBIO, ex vivo lenti gene therapy company that focuses in rare disease and in the first wave, particularly lysosomal storage disorders. So many of you may have seen the talk on this stage an hour ago, so I'll be a little brief, but we target Fabry-Gaucher-Pompe cystinosis, and the common denominator is one technology platform, same cells, same vector. We just switch out one disease-specific transgene to pivot from disease A, B, C, D. So we're in the clinic running 2 trials in parallel, an academic phase 1 trial that's ongoing in Canada, and we recently this summer initiated a phase 2 Fabry program where we dosed our first patient in Australia. And I guess the other news is we announced last Friday we received no objection letter CTA from Health Canada to begin work on our Gaucher phase 1/2 program.
Great.
Great.
Okay, Max?
Max Colao, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of Abeona Therapeutics. I'll be brief too, because I just literally presented this an hour ago as well. So we have 3 programs in the clinic. We're a cell and gene therapy company that's focused on rare disease. We're multimodality. We have a program in recessive dystrophic EB, and then we have programs in MPS 3A and 3B. We're very, very encouraged. You probably saw my enthusiasm as I was presenting. We're very encouraged by the early results, and we have RMAT designations for 2 of the programs. We have breakthrough designations, so lots of collaboration with the regulatory authorities in moving the programs forward. We also have a GMP facility that we've opened this year. And then also we're thinking about the next generation. So we have a proprietary AIM platform that we think is going to be very important, advantageous for our company. And just personally, I can also tell you that I'm just passionate about commercialization in rare disease. I've had a leadership role in 12 launches, 4 in rare disease. My first one 10 years ago, my last one 10 months ago. And I think it's a privilege to be in this room, to think about evolution, the evolutionary nature of gene therapy, and what the opportunity and challenges are in rare disease. I just think it's a very, very special time, and it's a privilege to be part of this group.
Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is start off discussing the kind of clinical focus around the rare diseases, and really talk about some of the kind of opportunities and challenges in there. And we're going to start with principally where there's an unmet need, and we'll move on to where there's a potential displacement in a few minutes. So we'll start off with unmet need, and the evolution of these trials is generally from highly specialist groups and specialist centres, or the treatments rather. So you've all taken over to a greater or lesser extent these studies from academia, where you started off with some very small trial sizes, and you've had to try to put a commercial shape on these very small numbers. So maybe we can start with Geoff around taking over some of these programs and trying to bring some sort of discipline or to more structure to the trial size and trial design, to get away from just individual cases, and get the structure that will get you all the way through the regulatory and licensing pathway.
Sure. So I think the most direct experience we have in that is our Fabry experience, where we really built the company initially around in-licensing an academic Fabry program from the teaching hospitals in the Toronto area. And the scientific founder, Geoff Medine, and his team of clinicians, it was really a group of all of the clinicians in Canada that treat Fabry across the country. And they've been working for years and years at developing and bringing this ex vivo gene therapy forward. And I think really what was just missing was a little bit of industry acumen to get it over the goal line in terms of scaling up, some CMC issues, regulatory submissions. But this academic group has, with our help, succeeded in getting into the clinic with a phase 1 program. Uh-huh. And as is the case with many of the gene therapies, is that the first wave of the technology is the first generation of the platform.
Yeah.
So in the ex vivo lenti world, what's kind of exciting about it is, you don't have an infinite number of things you can adjust. There's really 4 primary levers to focus on, and it's vector copy number, transduction efficiency, the cell dose, and the intensity of the conditioning. And so this academic team put forward an open manual process, so not really an optimized manufacturing process, without all of those levers necessarily optimized, but still, with good GMP rigor, got into the clinic and showed some pretty compelling results. And so from a company point of view, we have to, in parallel to supporting that and learning an awful lot from it, optimize the process. And for each of those parameters, get it up to levels where we have even greater confidence on long-term durability.
Right. And of course, you've reported some results just this week, which are kind of coming out of that historical, and the good, great news that one or two they've all shown an effect. One's off enzyme replacement, but there's been some vector copy number issues, I believe.
Yeah, so I guess we announced, as a public company, we announced a data release this Monday, and we updated on 3 of the 4 patients that have been dosed for Fabry, 2 in the phase 1, the academic phase 1, and first patient dosed in our global phase 2 program. And as you said, Keith, I think the happy circumstances without all of the optimization in place, going out as far as 18 months, all patients and all data points had very robust alpha-galactosidase A enzyme levels. And so that's important, and that's really what we're trying to do. But importantly, the name of the game is really getting these patients untethered from their biweekly infusions of ERT. And patient 1, after 18 months, ERT was withdrawn. And anecdotally, we didn't share data, we don't have blood draws yet, but anecdotally, the patient is out an additional 3 months ERT free. And often in this disease, even in between the 2 biweekly infusions, sometimes there's a sense of the patient having symptoms, fatigue, peripheral pain, and others. And so we're excited that the patient is now out approaching 3 months, and we'll continue to track these patients. And I think that so far we're encouraged. What we're also hoping to do when we continue to follow out in longer term time points is answer the question which remains unanswered, which is durability. Will this sustained effect go out beyond 18 months? And I guess our belief is that going back to those 4 levers, if you get VCN, transduction, dose, and conditioning right, there's no reason to expect anything other than the same durable response that has been shown many times with ex vivo lenti.
Oh, that's right. And, you know, you could cite lots of examples. So
Sure.
we'll move on to Matt.
Sure.
And because you've had similar experience with kind of taking over.
No, actually, we didn't. So the program, the lead program I mentioned earlier, MTM, when I founded the company, it was in preclinical stage.
Oh,
Had
okay.
some initial compelling proof of concept data from a mouse model and a dog model of the disease. But we had the opportunity to totally craft the clinical development vision ourselves. And given the nature of the disease, you heard how I described it earlier, clearly it's the type of disease where you hope that if you can develop a therapeutic that's safe and effective, that you can go as fast as possible. The great news about the environment we live in today is that from a regulatory perspective, it's a fruitful time, right? I mean, the agency led by Dr. Gottlieb has set a tone that we want to help advance these important innovative products, especially for serious and life-threatening diseases where there's no other treatment option, as fast and efficiently as possible. So we went into it recognizing the nature of the disease, recognizing the opportunity, what we'd seen in animals, and said, what can we do to design the best possible program to make this very robust and perhaps support a rapid path to approval. So we started with a medical record review study. We took the records of 120 boys living and deceased with the disease to try to learn from those records and build an understanding that was beyond what was available in the literature. Informative, not as informative as you might like, because they don't put a lot in a lot of medical records when there's no treatment, but nonetheless it was valuable, set a baseline. Then we ran a natural history and run-in study, as we call it. So no one had ever done such a study in myotubular myopathy. And so we designed a protocol and collected data on a basis over time using all the same assessments that we envisioned using in the phase 1/2, and collected as a result, of course, a nice prospectively defined data set in patients that educated us about their disease, the validity of those endpoints in a trial, and of course set a nice baseline that we could use as a comparator when we start the study. And then finally, in the phase 1/2, it's an open label phase 1/2 study, but it does have an element of control, which came from regulator discussions. I think the agency knew, just like we did, that gee, this is the kind of program that could move quickly and we'd like to collaborate on this. And so one of their suggestions was, is there a way to build in an element of control into the study? Right. And so we chose to include in each of our dose cohorts one untreated control patient, which is an extremely difficult conversation with everyone involved because these kids are dying. And so how do you justify that is not easy and straightforward, but where we can justify it, and we did so in collaboration with the patient community and the physicians, was if our goal is to get approval of this treatment globally as fast as possible, then let's design the best possible trial to get there. And everyone agreed. And so we've jumped into that, and thankfully now we've got compelling clinical data that's coming out of the trial. And our hope is that all those things we've done to try to be thoughtful about it will result in a rapid approval. Now, we'll see how that plays out exactly, but we've done all those things, and so I would encourage people who are looking to get into rare diseases, even though there's been a ton of work in rare diseases for many years, I think it's a time where there's enough history and knowledge that we can do thoughtful things in parallel or ahead of your clinical trial. It takes money, it takes people's time. That's hard to commit to, especially if you're a young company, but so valuable. Yeah. In particular, if you're working on something where there's no treatment. Yeah. So yeah. I like to talk about our experience, not to highlight just us, but because I hope it's helpful for the whole field.
Yeah, excellent, great. And Max?
Yeah, so we have, so all of our 3 programs are in diseases where there are no treatments, and they're, the diseases are devastating, deadly, pediatric focused. And we followed the same type of an approach, which is a phase 1/2 study that focuses on safety with efficacy endpoints embedded within it, control through a natural history studies that actually match endpoints across the studies. And I would probably just would add to, just again around the regulators and the collaborative nature of what's happening. Our regulatory discussions are confidential, but what I can tell you is that I've been just completely just taken aback at just how collaborative the discussions are. Our regulatory lead, who's been in industry for 30 years, mentioned in our last discussion, which was our Unmet discussion, that she had never been in 30 years in a meeting where the division head was part of the phone call, right? And the division head clearly was, and was very active as part of it. So, it's very clear that the regulators want to help bring the programs forward, and you can also see that there's a collective learning that the regulators are establishing across companies.
Do you think that the regulators are just like companies trying to learn their way in through rare diseases for when the bigger ones come?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And they're learning across companies. I think that's also clearly coming through that in their advice.
What about when you? Because I think some of your programs came out of academia, didn't they? Had the trials? Some of the trials already started, and by the time you formed a company, and how did that transition from an academic-led trial to a commercially led trial? How did that happen at that interface? And what were the lessons you learned there?
I think it's always an evolution, right? And you're always trying to build capabilities to continue to professionalize and bring additional experiences into your trial development and trial design. And I think we are still learning. We are still learning and continuing to evolve. So yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So, you're much further down the path, and you took that whole program over, didn't you?
That's correct. But just to kind of round out this discussion on academia, we at Enzovant are really living at that interface of academia and industry. As I mentioned, the data have been accruing at Duke for over a decade. And I think the real helpful thing to realize is that sometimes that the data are what the data are.
Yeah.
And you're not going to go back and fill in a lot of the gaps, because a lot of these studies and a lot of the investigation just wasn't built with the idea of pursuing an approval. And so most of these were academic projects where the data collection methods are obviously less robust than what the FDA is used to seeing. And what we've been able to do is to actually initiate that discussion. Don't be scared about it. I think the approach is to go to the FDA and say, listen, this is what we have. We know that we're trying to address a very, very high degree of unmet need. There are going to be gaps in that data. How do we address those gaps either before this gets submitted, or ideally even as a post-approval commitment? And so I think there's a lot of openness with the regulators to discuss what to do with data that are less than robust. And I'll give you a perfect example in the disease that we're working in. Because it's so rare, just the idea of having even patient narratives often helps supplement what that regulatory dossier is going to look like.
Right.
It doesn't replace the need for a robust statistical analysis, but it's something that can highly supplement that and really provide a picture of the totality of the data and the effect that it's having on an individual patient level. So I think that's one place where the FDA is getting more and more comfortable.
And I guess the clinical data sets are coming out, and like you said, they are what they are. But do you all have active searches for new biomarkers that might assist you in determining that? Because if you look for in other sectors, there's a rich data sets that a whole panel of biomarkers that can be used, and that's expanding more and more. But how have you approached that, or have you? Who wants to have a go?
It's always wonderful to work on a target that happens to have a good biomarker at your disposal, but that doesn't always exist. In MTM, there's no good biomarker. And so we've just had to fight on and look for measuring efficacy in terms of clinical endpoints that made sense to us, and muscle biopsies where we look at the tissue and evaluate our product and its effect. So, but we also work in a rare liver disease called Crigler-Najjar syndrome, where bilirubin levels in the serum are a key defining aspect of the disease, and that's obviously very easy to measure. We don't actually think of that as a biomarker. We think of it as a clinically relevant endpoint, but nonetheless, it's just the nature of the disease and the target. So sometimes you have that, and sometimes you don't.
Right.
Right. And in some cases you might fight during development to try to establish one, but I think can be very challenging.
Yeah. Geoff?
Yeah, well, I think you framed it as diseases where there's an unmet need versus a standard of care.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, you know, we're firmly entrenched in diseases where there's both.
Right.
You know, is
Right.
that, you know, we're targeting areas where there's an established standard of care, but looking at Fabry as an example, with today's standard of care, life is still cut short, 2 decades, kidney, cardiac, GI continues to deteriorate. But the benefit of targeting diseases where there is a standard of care is a lot of the things that were mentioned, you know, ranging from natural history studies to well-established primary and secondary endpoints, you know, not only biomarkers, but biomarkers that have gone through the regulatory process. So
Right.
again, looking at Fabry, you know, a chaperone therapy got approval with kidney substrate data recently. And so there's an awful lot of steps that you can skip when you're focused on markets that others have already de-risked to, at least they're clarified
Right.
to an extent.
Right. And of course, with you know, treatment with thymic cells, I don't even know where you'd begin on that story in looking for the kind of biomarkers in as a response to that treatment.
Yeah, the neat thing about this therapy is because it's been used over a long period of time, there are actually mortality data that can be used. And so that's about as hard an endpoint as you can have. And so given that there's mortality benefit, we haven't seen the need to go back and look at other biomarkers.
Right.
It's a different story for our other therapeutic, which is an enzyme replacement therapy,
Sure.
where, you know, we are actively looking for biomarkers.
Right.
But for this one in particular, it's not been an issue.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to move on to another one where, again, mainly on the unmet need side, which is competition for targets. Now, you know, with the explosion in gene therapy, especially in the rare diseases, competition for targets can be an issue. So, you know, the one that springs to mind for me is ADA SCID. You're kind of hunting for targets because everybody's been in a trial. But I noticed that both Avro and Audentes are both doing POMP. So, you know, is that an issue? Competition for targets with trying to find the you know, all the patients that are eligible for trials. Anyone suffered any issues on that one, or has it been relatively straightforward to recruit?
I would say, first of all, I think it's a wonderful world to live in. If there's a lot of investment and research from different companies with different technologies to try to help patients with these diseases. I mean, it's just that simple. So does it add complexity if other people are in the space? Sure. You know, I mean, inevitably you're looking for people's time and effort and commitment, including patients and caregivers, to working together on studies, and so it's an extra factor, but you know, it doesn't seem, we don't see it as a real driver of challenge for us as a business. We think we can make it happen. Obviously, you have to get people enthusiastic about your story, and so your data and your theoretical approach should be good, but I think it's doable. There's no question that as we go after, in particular, larger targets, there'll be competition, will be a real thing, but we don't worry about it. I think it's manageable, and it's in the end the best for patients.
Yeah, I saw you kind of nodding when I said that. So obviously you've had a
Well,
experience in there.
I completely agree that this is a good problem to have, right? Even if you think about multiple companies taking on different modalities, coming into similar diseases, right? So, like MPS III, there are multiple companies in that space, and I think that's actually a good problem to have, because we don't know exactly what modality will be effective, and there's a point here that clearly that's echoed throughout the day, which is being first counts, right? And clearly it's very intuitive that being first counts, but it's also I would add to that, it's also exceptionally important to be first with the right vector and the right gene and the right promoter, and that's not trivial, right? So that's why that's why we've chosen a certain approach that we've taken on in MPS with AAV that goes across the blood-brain barrier and is able to deliver gene and promoter to neurons. And so I think this is a good problem to have, and again, it goes back to this kind of learning and evolution within our industry.
Sure. Okay, we're going to move on now to disruption of existing paradigms. with things like enzyme replacement therapies and haemophilia. Haemophilia is one of my favorites, but I know, you know, I haven't got an example of that here to go after. I mean, haemophilia, I think, you know, it's a huge market out there, and it's an extremely sensitized patient population, and it's not, you know, how are things like demonstration of superiority, you know, what are the clinical and commercial factors in there? What are not just the health technology assessment agencies thinking, but what are the actual treating clinicians thinking about how they're going to move somebody off one treatment and onto another? And I'm afraid you're up first again, Geoff, because you're probably right in the whole strategy is around that, isn't it?
Yeah. The first wave of targeting these lysosomal storage disorders is essentially trying to be the next disruptive therapy after enzyme replacement therapy. Is for the patients we target 25 years ago, they essentially had very little option, and you know, real champions like Henry Tamir, Genzyme, Shire shortly thereafter really did an amazing job. They went from no solution to having a solution, but there's just no question that today's standard of care leaves opportunity for something better. Now, you know, when we decided to build the company, we wanted to target initially diseases with really well understood biology. Right. And what we loved about the fact that there was this established standard of care is that what was already addressed through, you know, 40 years of research and 20 years of clinical experience was the notion of delivering exogenous enzyme to this patient population does some good. You know, so when you're building a company, probability of success matters.
Right.
And you know, I think that was formidable, and it was also important for us to target disease areas that had a meaningful commercial opportunity, not just in terms of total number of patients, but that the market was built and established. And again, the pioneers, the Shires and Genzymes, spent 20 years identifying and corralling patients into care and building all the infrastructure around that. So there's just something attractive about, you know, endpoints existing, patients in care, proof of concept being de-risked by the first generation of enzyme delivery. And what gene therapy is meant to do is to say, okay, now what's next? Let's try to improve the kinetics and deliver 24/7 enzyme.
Right. And Alvin, you've got a long history in rare diseases. How do you see that one playing out? And what do you see the commercial response from, you know, the people you're trying to disrupt and displace?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and what I can address it from is a perspective of clinicians as well as, you know, I'm in frequent contact with patients and families with rare disease, and in fact just came from the Global Genes Conference right up the road, which is one of the largest assemblies of rare disease patients and advocates. And I can tell you there's a lot of excitement around the potential for one-and-done treatments. And I think that people really intuitively get the concept, and I think really understand the value that something like that could bring, even in spaces where there are existing therapies. So Geoff is very right. There's a lot of pent-up demand for these sorts of therapies because of the view that these could be potentially definitive or curative.
Yeah. So I guess I think, you know, Geoff and Alvin, where you've got clear superiority in near-term clinical outcomes, that switch is going to be easier than, I guess it's going to be easier than where the clinical superiority is less. You know, haemophilia, as a for instance, certain ones there. You know, the people are in a very settled treatment regime. I think one and done would be fantastic, but you know, are they going to sit back and let it happen? Are the clinicians going to jump there where maybe the superiority isn't quite as clear cut? I don't know. Who wants to have a go at that?
Well, I'll throw in my 2 cents is that I think again going with LSDs and enzyme replacement therapy, I think that there's multiple potential advantages. Is that one, just untethering these patients from the biweekly infusions is an advantage. And looking at some of them, Fabry as an example, the lifetime cost of a Fabry patient is $14 million on today's standard of care. So it really doesn't matter how you price a gene therapy, it will save the healthcare system a fortune, and it will free up the patient from these biweekly infusions. But as you said, the issue of superiority is, the premise, the target product profile is to outperform, and the notion is constantly bathing these cells, tissues, organs, and enzyme, as opposed to a stop-start of biweekly infusions, will translate. But what will be a claim in a label is really dependent on the clinical development path. And in our field, in gene therapy, it could be a single-arm trial, and that will be a negotiation. It could be compared to natural history, or it could be controlled versus today's standard of care. Even if it is, it's quite likely that it would be a non-inferiority trial. So I take your point. I think that, depending on the clinical pathway, you may not be able to make a head-to-head claim that this is statistically better, but I think that the overall value proposition to patients, if you could free them up and show value in a well-designed trial, our view is that that's pretty compelling. Sure. We've done some pretty extensive market research really around the world with our diseases, where we've shown what we think is a fair target product profile to clinicians and then to patients, but focused with clinicians, and really asking them, for which patient segments would you feel this could be a first-line therapy ahead of today's standard of care? And it's different by segment, if they're controlled on standard of care, uncontrolled, or switch stable. But clearly, the majority are very motivated. And interestingly, the younger the patient, the more motivated. They want to get ahead of their disease. Right. So we're encouraged that I think if we or any of these therapies really deliver what we hope to, that there could be pretty good adoption.
And if I can add, one point, having launched 2 enzyme replacement therapies and also worked on Solaris, which is for rare disease, and it's been on market for more than 10 years. The patients are going to be an incredible force in providing education and also in driving choice. Because you have to think about, too, that in many rare diseases, the physicians are treating one patient. Right? And even in Solaris, with 10 years out, we've still found that 2/3 of the physicians still to this day, they would identify and treat their first patient. Right. So I think the patient community is going to be a very important force in both education as well as driving some treatment choice.
Okay. I'm going to actually go straight now then to. I'll skip technical challenges. Maybe I'll come back to them. But because you've managed, we started talking about attitudes to the therapies from patients. Families, the kind of role of advocacy, the role of clinicians, and actually the role of the public in all of this. I mean, to my mind, it's really important that we get that right. And I wonder what you're doing from a company perspective to kind of get those touch points right, because it's such a personal interaction with either the patients or the clinicians, but then you've got an amorphous interaction with the public. So, Matt?
Sure. As people have heard before in the rare disease world, it's just so important to partner with the patient community. And every case is a bit different, right? Every disease is a little different as to how well organized the community is. But we live in a world where people are motivated, especially if they happen to be the parent of a child with one of these terrible diseases, that they try to mobilize and organize, and it's really important to partner with those people. And I mentioned earlier how we tried to do that from very early on. So we invested, as I believe many rare disease companies do today, in patient advocacy as a function, a core area of expertise, and made the effort to communicate, because it's such a human aspect to our work. You know, working in the rare disease is very human, and that sounds odd, but you know, I think you know what I mean. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They try to the idea of someone having a child and having this disease and the panic, the research. I mean, we can all imagine it, and I'm sure some people are living it, and so understanding that, appreciating that, and building that sort of communication into your thinking is just critical. To take it more broadly, and this becomes an ARM-related topic, actually. There's an incredible need for education around what we do, right? And unfortunately, we're living currently in a world where products like ours are getting talked about because of high price tags, not because of the power of the innovation and what they're bringing to patients. So, and the fundamental missing link there to me is education and understanding and awareness of what the science is, what does gene therapy mean. And so we have a huge task ahead of us to educate the public, to educate payers, to educate policymakers, and we all have a responsibility to that. ARM obviously is very focused on that, the ARM Foundation. It's its core initiative, so that's a huge part of the long-term success for everything that we're trying to do, is that people understand and appreciate what we do and can contrast it with other things in our space that seem to take a lot of airtime.
Yeah. So Alvin, I mean, since you've moved from, I think it was Pfizer and the rare diseases unit there into this space, have you had to alter your thinking at all about that kind of issue?
That sort of engagement with patients? Yeah, I think there's a tendency at some of the larger organizations that aren't as experienced on the rare disease side to be somewhat scared, if you will, of patient contact, and you really can't do rare disease drug development if you do not have that direct engagement with patients. And I think the key here, as well as communication, which Matt already brought up, is the idea that you really have to commit to a particular community of patients.
Right.
And you have to be willing to give and invest before you even ask anything of that community. Right. And as an example of that, our company sponsored the first ever gathering of Complete to George families. And these were families from all across the world who had never really even met each other in person. There was a Facebook group, but there was no official organization that really bonded them together. And so we saw that it was an opportunity to really enable the dialogue to occur as a community and to really help them understand what it is that they wanted to do. Not what we wanted to do, but what they wanted to do as a community. And I think that was really well received, and it's something that, ultimately down the road may come back and help us to develop some of our thinking around access and around patient needs and so on. But that really wasn't even the focus. The focus was just to enable them to come together as a community. And I think that sort of effort is really important and sends the right signals.
Yeah. So Max, I mean, one of the treatments that you've got is designed for EB. They're quite a well-organized community.
Yes.
So how have you found that?
So this is it's working with the patient advocacy organization and foundation is just a tremendous part of our focus. Now it's part of our heritage because we were founded by 12 patient advocacy foundations. So we have a strong working ongoing relationships. But just to echo the points here, I think the education, even within the patient advocacy groups, you see some different levels of education around the understanding what gene therapy is or isn't. Right. And again, I just want to echo that point, which is really to, in both shifting the conversation from price to understanding the transformational impact of gene therapy, to helping kind of understand what, to kind of also take the science fiction or Twilight Zone part out of the people's kind of reaction to gene therapy. It's just I think it's a paramount success factor for us all.
Yeah. So as we kind of move from, that's mainly, we talked about the patients and families and advocacy there, and of course, generally speaking, the public's pretty positive when the story's good. Must have been pretty tough to, thinking through where you have the single control one, how that might play out in the community as well, for your trial, Matt?
You know, we put in so much effort going into it before it was even a final decision, and so it has actually gone smoothly. You know, because we partnered with the patient organizations in particular, and we have a regular quarterly meeting of a patient committee or patient organization leadership board, as we call it. It's basically get together with the leaders of all the different U.S. and European-based organizations and give them the updates that we can within the bounds of being a publicly traded company. But anyway, having conversations like that to help people understand why we would do such a thing. We only, obviously people understand in the informed consent that it's a possibility they'll get randomized to non-treatment. We also promise them the optimal dose once we identify that.
Right.
And so in a way they have the advantage of knowing they'll get the best dose and they'll get it before it's approved. Yeah. So that helps a bit, right? But it's still stressful, candidly. But I do believe will help translate to faster availability of the product globally. And that is the ultimate goal that we're striving for.
Okay, I'm going to loop back now to some of the technical challenges, and you know, we've got a really good selection of different modalities and platforms here. You know, the fundamental one is kind of in vivo versus ex vivo approaches, tissue targeting, scale. I guess I'm not sure scale's been a particularly big issue for you guys, but certainly, you know, choosing the mechanism you're going to do, and of course, you know, Abeona's got a right mix of different modalities there. So, you know, maybe can you start talking about the kind of technical challenges that you've had to do? I mean, as diverse as growing skin and you know, transforming it versus AAV transfusions.
Sure,
you know,
sure.
That's quite a broad portfolio of things to be good at.
Right. And you highlighted, you know, these programs came out of academic centers, right? And so I think some of the technical challenges are being able to translate the manufacturing from, you know, academic labs into a GMP world. And so I think that's something that we all are kind of working through, and frankly also, I mean, just from a talent standpoint, right? The talent and expertise is quite a bit in the academic centers. It hasn't completely built out in our industry yet, right? So I think overcoming the technical challenges clearly needs, it needs, capabilities and people and know-how, and I think that's building. And what we're doing is, as I mentioned, we clearly are working with CMC partners, as well as developing our own GMP manufacturing capabilities on both sides, on parallel sides, because we want to be able to, we want to be able to provide access as quickly as possible.
But even for EB, which is relatively rare, I mean, you've got a process there where you're having to make a lot of skin. And I know somebody else who knows about making lots of skin. You've got to make a lot of skin, you've got to get it right, you've got to do all of this stuff. That's probably going to get bigger than you probably calculated right at the beginning, or even thought about. I mean,
we're thinking.
Does it turn into a real scale issue for you, even for a rare disease?
And you have to kind of create option plays, right? Make decisions and create option plays. So we started with a 5,000 square foot GMP facility. Right. We have another 20,000 square feet, ready to go. Right. And then we have, additional beyond that, right? But you want to be able to make these. You want to stage these choices and investments. As the program is developing, right? And so that's the approach that we're taking. I'm
going to go down to Alvin now, because I mean you've got the kind of the more unusual cell source and how that plays out, and I know nothing about that, and you're going to tell me everything about it now.
Yeah, so again, this is the diversity component of it, because we run into issues almost at the opposite end of the spectrum of scale, because we are operating in such a small space and for such a limited number of patients, at least for this initial indication, that oftentimes I run into issues of people even wanting to have a discussion around, a commercial or a development or a manufacturing partner because it's so small scale. And so what we've been doing, the technical challenge for us is actually working with Duke, who can supply a lot of, or the complete amount of material that's needed to treat this patient population, and how to help them run a aseptic manual process in a way that meets GMP criteria, and that going forward will enable some scalability. And so that's a very, very different discussion. And again, it enters this realm of, what can an academic institution do versus what has to happen outside. For us, we're incredibly blessed that Duke has already commercialized a product and has a facility that is accustomed to running a GMP process. So we're working within that constraint in order to fire up this first round. Going forward, obviously, it makes sense to evaluate all options and understand how to build in additional scalability.
Sure.
But it's a very different process.
Okay. And Matt, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, which is about tissue targeting. Because when I was doing my homework, I kind of saw that you've got tissues from for the X-linked myotubular myopathy. It's a muscle. It's a lot a lot of muscle. You've got crudular, liver, Pompeii, muscle and nerve. You've got the CASQ2 cardiac muscle. How have you thought about each of those as a kind of a target and the technical things that you've got to adjust to for each of those kind of target modalities?
Well, each of them have core scientific principles that make them attractive targets as for AAV gene therapy, meaning monogenic disease, well understood biology. We try to target diseases where the tissue we're trying to treat is reasonably healthy if possible. Ideally replacing a protein you don't need at normal levels to have a therapeutic effect. So those are hallmarks of each of the programs. But over time, we had confidence, but with time have been able to show that we can really deliver on getting to those tissues in a couple different ways with our approach. Number one, can you give a dose that's high enough to get to muscle, to get broad biodistribution, and is it well tolerated? And we developed a wonderful preclinical data set to show that, and now in the clinic it's going very well. And so I think that's a fundamental answer to our space, certainly in neuromuscular disease that's been key. Partnering these constructs with promoters that are focused and can allow for expression in a targeted manner in the diseases affected by the disease is also a core principle of ours, and a clear advancement of the science over the last decade in particular that's key and I think a great way to improve patient outcomes from a safety and efficacy standpoint. So we keep all those things in mind. The manufacturing piece is core for us. We invested 3.5 years ago in our own internal GMP operations and manufacture at 1,000-liter scale in a mammalian cell-based system, serum-free suspension culture that's extremely robust and makes a very high-quality product. We happen to believe in mammalian cells as the best manufacturing source of AAV viral vectors because that's the natural host cell, and we believe that we've shown that we make a very high-quality version of the product because when you look in the muscle biopsies of kids with MTM in our clinical trial, we were getting higher vector copy number and protein expression than anyone's seen in the field. So we're quite proud of that. So all those things, are technical factors that we've tried to think through carefully, and so far so good.
Okay, great. And Geoff, you basically you've got Lenti CD34 process, and is it the same for all of these? And you're optimizing it for and trying to deliver, different, for different diseases through the same platform?
We're certainly trying to leverage one platform, one ex vivo Lenti platform. And so as I said earlier, same cells, same vector, switch out a disease-specific transgene. Now, different diseases have different needs and different clinical bars. And so the first few indications, it really is, in our opinion, a matter of achieving sufficient engraftment such that the progeny of the engrafted CD34 hematopoietic stem cells will manufacture and distribute protein systemically and locally. But as we continue to evolve, we're now looking at diseases where, as Matt said, you actually want to do more than that. You want to specifically target whether it's an organ or whether it's crossing the blood-brain barrier. And so that's gotten us to really invest in some advanced tag technologies which can increase, not only rely on gene therapy to deliver prolific levels of enzymes systemically, but engineer in things like a lysosomal uptake tag to increase uptake.
Right. Okay, so we've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on adoption and maybe squeeze one or two questions at the end. So I think you're, Alvin, you're in kind of pre-registration right now.
That's right. So BLA
you
has
must
started.
be thinking about adoption and commercial and all of that good stuff. And of course, because of the nature of rare diseases and the size of the trials, everybody's a lot nearer that than many other diseases.
Sure.
So,
Right.
What's keeping you awake at night on adoption? Is it reimbursement? Is it clinical infrastructure, or is it the pathways? Is it the regulator? Which is the hungry dog you've got to feed first?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wouldn't be a rare disease panel if we didn't at least address pricing and reimbursement in some way. And if you think about it, really is, I think, the final frontier. We live in such an amazing time where there's just a confluence of positive factors. We have numerous tailwinds. The scientific and clinical piece, the regulatory piece, and the technical elements, I think, are all in the process of getting solved or answered. But the issue of access to these therapies and how they're going to be reimbursed still has not yet been decided. And it's because we're just so early in the game. So I think the key is for us to have a dialogue, as an industry, and also with the stakeholders who are ultimately going to be responsible for delivering those therapies, and to just have an open and honest discussion around the value that these therapies are bringing and how they can be worked into the overall payment plan and budget for the health authorities that are in question. And I think ultimately it will be some kind of value-based or outcome-based relationship that will really drive these things forward.
Okay.
So we've been in numerous discussions with both public and private payers, even in advance of the BLA being completed, in order to just say, hey, listen, we want to understand how you're thinking about this. These aren't pre-approval discussions. These are just what are the frameworks that would be acceptable for you? And we've heard answers that are all over the map.
Right.
So I think there will be some policy type interventions that will be helpful. There will be some elements of us banding together as an industry, working through groups like ARM to really move forward on frameworks that will be sustainable over time.
Okay, Matt, do you want to add something to that?
I'm extremely passionate about this subject, Keith. So
I know you are.
Look, we have to innovate in commercial issues just like we're innovating on R&D. And it requires creative thinking. This is a huge challenge, but what a disgrace it would be to figure out the science and get products approved and no patients can get access to them.
Yeah.
And right now, that's kind of where we are. And it has to improve. The good news is I think good dialogue has started. Everyone's, I think, holding hands and talking about it, but I'm ready for action on this because we need to show that we can succeed in getting these products to patients globally with each of our products.
And it should be easier for ultra rare and rare, really rare stuff, because the budget impact isn't as great as the more.
Yeah, but you still have to come up with an environment where it just makes sense, right? I don't want to sit across the table from a payer or someone at CMS and say that this product is this big number up front, and that's it. Because I'm also showing up with 2 or 3 years of data.
Yeah.
It's just not credible. That's not who I am. That's not who our company is. And I think a lot of people aren't comfortable with that conversation. But that's the world we live in today, structurally, at least in the United States.
Yeah.
So let's move past that. Let's all agree that we can live in a world where some sort of payment over time, call it risk sharing, call it annuity, call it whatever, but it's basically, let's modify our system so that for products like this, it can be an option. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but an option for a company to offer a payment over time.
Right.
And that can come in so many different flavors, number of years or whatever it might be. Outcomes-based or not, also depends. But nonetheless, let's make that a structural possibility in the United States because it's absolutely going to increase the speed and speed with which patients get access to these products.
Well, you've taken over the chair of ARM just at the right time. Yeah. Geoff?
Yeah, well, I couldn't say it better than Matt. Maybe one pragmatic point to add is that, in this interim phase, when it's very difficult for payers to value and reimburse according to value, it does behoove us to build an argument, and that our perspective is that diseases where there are very tangible direct cost offsets, that argument is just easier.
Yeah.
So that gets back to established markets where you can say, for every year that you've taken a person off X, you've saved $250,000, $300,000, $400,000. So I think our job is to show safety, efficacy, tolerability, health economics. But certainly we all recognize that we have to take on that extra step of helping to reshape the healthcare system.
And give the system something back as well.
And it requires investment and time during development, right? I mean, we spend a ton of time trying to characterize the burden of myotubular myopathy to patients, to the system. And so it's just something you have to start working on early. It's not, we don't live in a world where you just have to get regulatory approval in rare diseases and things will work themselves out.
By anything.
It's two major conversations. It's the regulators and it's payers. And so I got to do the work.
Okay, and the last word from Max.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there's just a tremendous amount of work to do, right? And so it's not things that are keeping me up at night, it's get me out of bed early, right? Because they're very positive things that we have to do. And I think beyond the reimbursement side, I would also add that there's clinical infrastructure that we need to build. As you talked about the kind of the EB program, that's not likely going to be every dermatologist, prescribed. That's likely going to be more of a center of excellence type of model and specialist. And so there's a lot to shaping to do on that side of our healthcare delivery side as well.
And just like London buses, there's a lot arriving at once. Yeah. Okay. So look, I'm over time. I don't know whether there's time for questions. No time for questions. So look, the panel's been great. Give them a big hand, and I'm sure you'll give it a later on.